I spent 2 years fighting cancer, and when the final treatment ended, the nurse looked around the room and quietly asked a question that changed everything. Is your family on the way? I remember the sound of the 4 pump beside me, the soft rhythmic click that had become the background noise of my life for nearly 24 months. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee from the cup that had been sitting on the windowsill since early morning. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low over the parking lot, turning the rows of cars into dull reflections of orange light. I looked at the empty chair beside my bed, the one that families usually fill while they wait, and for a moment I thought maybe the nurse was mistaken, maybe Daniel was just running late, maybe Rachel had trouble finding parking, maybe my grandson Ethan was finishing homework before they drove over. I smiled politely and told her they were probably on their way, but deep down I already knew the truth. That chair had stayed empty for 2 years. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and for the last 2 years my life had been measured not by holidays or birthdays but by chemotherapy appointments scheduled every 3 weeks like clockwork. The first time I walked into the oncology wing I thought my son would be sitting beside me. Daniel used to call me every Sunday when he was in college, even if it was just to say he needed laundry money or advice about a class. When he got married, I told myself things would change a little, that families grow, people get busy, life becomes complicated. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, always spoke politely when we met, though there was a careful distance in her voice, like someone being friendly to a neighbor they barely knew. When the doctor told me the diagnosis 2 years ago, the first person I called was Daniel. He answered after the 3rd ring and said he was in the middle of a meeting. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the magnet calendar on the refrigerator, trying to figure out how to say the word cancer without making it sound too heavy. "We'll talk tonight," he said quickly, and the line went quiet. That night came and went. And the conversation never happened the way I imagined. Instead there were brief messages. A text asking how the appointment went. Another text saying work had been hectic. I told myself that was enough. Mothers are good at convincing themselves of things that make their children look better than reality. My first chemotherapy session was on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I wore a light sweater because everyone told me the treatment rooms were always cold. I brought a paperback novel that I never actually opened because I kept checking the door every time footsteps passed by. Other patients had families sitting beside them, husbands holding hands, daughters adjusting blankets, sons bringing coffee from the cafeteria downstairs. I kept telling myself Daniel would walk in any minute with that apologetic smile he used when he was late to something important. But the hours passed, the 4 bags slowly emptied, and eventually the nurse removed the line from my arm and told me I could go home. I drove back alone that afternoon through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, the kind of streets where people plant American flags in their front yards and mow their lawns every Saturday morning. My house looked the same as always when I pulled into the driveway, but something about it felt different, like the silence inside had grown heavier. Weeks turned into months, and months quietly became a year. Each treatment followed the same rhythm. I would wake up early, drive the 12 miles to St. Matthew's Medical Center, check in at the desk, and sit among strangers who gradually became familiar faces. Some of them brought family members every time. Others came alone like I did. We nodded to each other sometimes, the way people do when they share an experience that's too complicated to explain out loud. Daniel called occasionally during that first year, usually late in the evening when he sounded tired. Rachel rarely spoke to me directly, though I could hear her voice faintly in the background sometimes, reminding him about dinner reservations or asking where he left the car keys. I told myself that was normal. People have busy lives. Young couples build their own worlds. Mothers are supposed to understand that. The second year was harder. Treatments take a quiet toll on a person, not just physically but in ways that creep slowly into everyday moments. Grocery shopping becomes exhausting. Climbing the stairs feels like finishing a long hike. There were days I sat in my living room watching afternoon light move across the carpet and wondered how something so serious could exist alongside such ordinary stillness. And through all of it, that empty chair beside my hospital bed never changed. Sometimes I imagined what it would look like if Daniel walked through the door. I could picture him wearing the navy jacket he always wore to work, carrying coffee for both of us, apologizing for not being there sooner. But imagination has limits, and reality eventually speaks louder. The last treatment came on a quiet Thursday in early fall. The trees outside the hospital had just begun turning gold along the edges, and the air had that crisp smell that reminds you winter is not far away. The nurse who disconnected my force smiled warmly and told me I had finished the final round. She said many families celebrate that moment together. Then she glanced at the empty chair beside my bed and asked softly, "Is your family on the way?" I looked at the door again, just in case, and then I realized something I probably should have understood a long time ago. Some battles you fight with people beside you. And some you fight completely alone. I told the nurse that my family was probably busy and that I would call them later, and she nodded in that careful way medical staff learn when they know more than they say out loud. The paperwork took about 15 minutes to finish, and during that time the hallway outside my room filled with small celebrations. I could hear a bell ringing somewhere near the nurse's station, followed by clapping and cheerful voices. Someone down the hall had completed treatment with their entire family gathered around them. Their laughter echoed faintly through the corridor. I sat quietly on the edge of the bed while the nurse removed the last adhesive bandage from my arm. When she finished, she handed me a folded packet of discharge instructions and told me to take it easy for the next few weeks. I thanked her, gathered my purse, and walked slowly toward the elevator. Hospitals have a particular smell when you leave them after a long stay, a mixture of disinfectant and cafeteria coffee that somehow follows you all the way to the parking lot. The afternoon air outside felt cooler than I expected, and for a moment I stood beside my car simply breathing, letting the silence settle around me. 2 years earlier I had imagined this day very differently. I had pictured Daniel standing beside me, perhaps with Rachel and Ethan nearby, all of us smiling with that quiet relief people feel when a storm finally passes. Instead there was only the low hum of traffic from the highway a mile away and the sound of a shopping cart rattling across the pavement as someone returned it to the grocery store next door. I drove home slowly that afternoon, the same route I had taken dozens of times over the past 2 years. 12 miles along Maple Avenue, past the gas station with the faded red sign, past the elementary school where Daniel once played Little League baseball on summer evenings. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking about how ordinary everything looked. Life continues around you even when your own world has been turned inside out. When I reached my street the sun was beginning to lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet row of houses. My home sat exactly as it always had, a small white house with blue shutters that my late husband Richard painted himself more than a decade ago. The porch light was off. The mailbox was closed. Nothing about it suggested that someone had just finished a battle that lasted 2 full years. Inside the house the air felt still, as though it had been waiting patiently for my return. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and placed the hospital paperwork beside the fruit bowl that still held 3 apples I had bought earlier in the week. The clock above the stove read 4:20 in the afternoon. For a long moment I simply stood there listening to the quiet tick of the second hand. Then I did what I had done after every treatment appointment. I picked up my phone and checked for messages. There was one text from Daniel, sent 3 hours earlier. It read, "Let me know how the appointment goes today." That was all. No question about how I felt. No mention of coming by later. I stared at the message longer than I probably should have, as though the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something warmer if I waited long enough. They did not. I typed a short reply telling him the treatment was finished and that the doctor said I could go home. I added a small smile at the end of the sentence because that felt polite. Then I set the phone back down on the counter. Evening crept into the house gradually the way it often does in early autumn. The kitchen window faced west, and the fading sunlight filtered through the curtains Richard had chosen years ago when we first renovated the room. He always liked soft yellow fabric because he said it made the whole house feel warmer. I remember sitting at the kitchen table and tracing the edge of a scratch on the wood surface, one that Daniel made accidentally when he was 12 years old while trying to assemble a science project. Richard had laughed about it at the time and said every house needs a few marks to prove that a family lived there. I wondered briefly whether Daniel remembered that moment at all. Around 6 o'clock my phone buzzed again. For a second my heart lifted, thinking perhaps Daniel had decided to call. Instead it was a message from Rachel. She wrote that Daniel was working late and that they had a dinner reservation with friends, but that they hoped my appointment went well. The message ended with a polite smile emoji. I read it twice, then set the phone down once more. The house remained quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. I walked into the living room and sat in Richard's old armchair beside the window. From that spot you could see the maple tree in the front yard beginning to turn shades of red and gold. Richard planted that tree the year Daniel turned 10. He used to say it would grow taller than the house one day. Watching the branches move gently in the evening breeze, I realized something that had been slowly forming in my mind for months but had never quite settled into words. I had spent 2 years hoping my family would appear at the door when things became difficult. I had spent 2 years telling myself that their absence had reasonable explanations. Work schedules. Busy lives. Travel plans. But sitting there in that quiet room, with the autumn light fading beyond the window and the hospital wristband still loosely wrapped around my arm, I understood something much simpler. When people truly want to be present in your life, they find a way to show up. And when they do not, silence becomes its own kind of answer. The next morning the house felt different in a way that was difficult to explain, not quieter exactly but clearer, as if the silence had finally settled into its proper place. I woke up just after 7 when the early sunlight slipped through the thin curtains in my bedroom, casting long pale stripes across the wooden floor. For 2 years my mornings had followed a strange routine shaped by medical appointments and fatigue, but that day there was no alarm reminding me to drive to the hospital and no appointment waiting on a calendar. The realization felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room that had been locked for a long time. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the morning gather around me, listening to the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street and the faint chirping of birds in the maple tree outside the window. Eventually I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker, the same old machine Richard bought nearly 8 years ago during one of his practical shopping trips when he insisted that simple appliances last longer than complicated ones. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room slowly, warm and steady, and for a moment it reminded me of Sunday mornings years ago when Daniel used to visit before he was married. Back then he would sit at this very table, still half asleep, drinking orange juice and asking if I had made pancakes. I poured myself a cup and carried it to the small table by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning its usual weekday rhythm. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the street. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk across the road. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before and the day before that, which made the previous 2 years feel almost invisible to the world beyond my front yard. I took a sip of coffee and reached for my phone again out of habit. There were no new messages. Daniel had not responded to my text from the previous evening, and Rachel had not written anything further. I placed the phone back on the table and stared at the small hospital wristband still resting on the counter beside the fruit bowl. It had my name printed on it in black letters along with a barcode and the date of my last treatment. I turned it over slowly in my fingers, thinking about how many times nurses had scanned that code during the past 24 months. A small plastic band can represent a surprising amount of time when you look at it closely. Around 9 o'clock the phone finally rang. The sudden sound echoed across the kitchen and made me look up from the window. For a brief moment I imagined Daniel calling to ask if I needed anything or if he could stop by after work. But when I checked the screen I saw the name of St. Matthew's Medical Center instead. I answered politely, expecting perhaps a routine follow-up from the oncology department. Instead the voice on the other end belonged to a nurse named Carol who had helped during several of my appointments. She said she simply wanted to check on how I was feeling after the final treatment and to remind me about a follow-up visit scheduled in 6 weeks. Her voice was kind in that calm professional way medical staff develop after years of speaking with patients who carry complicated emotions. I thanked her and told her I was doing well. She paused briefly before asking if my family had celebrated with me yet. The question hung gently in the air between us, and for a second I did not know how to answer. I could have explained the situation, but something about that felt unnecessary. Instead I told her that everyone had been busy but that I was grateful the treatments were finished. She wished me a good day and the call ended quietly. After I set the phone down, I noticed the sunlight had shifted further across the kitchen floor. The house was still peaceful, and for the first time in months I did not feel the weight of the hospital schedule pressing against the hours of the day. I decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood, something I had not done regularly during treatment because even small distances once felt exhausting. The air outside was cool and fresh as I stepped onto the front porch. Autumn had begun to settle across the town, and the leaves along Maple Avenue had started turning shades of red and amber. I walked slowly along the sidewalk, passing the same houses I had seen every day for years. Some neighbors waved politely from their driveways. Others were already leaving for work. No one knew that the quiet woman walking past their lawns had just completed 2 years of medical treatment the day before. I reached the corner of the street and paused beside the small park where Daniel used to play when he was young. The basketball court still stood in the same place, the metal hoops slightly rusted but intact. Watching the empty court, I remembered the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing across the pavement on summer afternoons while Richard sat on the nearby bench pretending to read the newspaper. Those memories felt distant now, like photographs stored in an album that no one had opened in years. After a few minutes I turned back toward my house, noticing the way the maple tree in the front yard cast a long shadow across the grass. When I stepped inside again, the kitchen clock read almost 11. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the table once more. The silence around me no longer felt heavy. Instead it felt honest, like the kind of quiet that appears after a storm finally passes and the sky clears enough for you to see things the way they truly are. For 2 years I had waited for my family to show up during the most difficult chapter of my life. Now, sitting there in the calm light of a late morning with the hospital behind me and the future quietly unfolding ahead, I began to realize something unexpected. Surviving the illness had changed more than my health. It had changed the way I understood who was truly present in my life and who was only there in memory. I did not realize how many small signs I had ignored until the quiet days after my final treatment began to stretch into a calm routine. When you spend 2 years hoping for people to appear, your mind becomes very skilled at creating explanations for their absence. I had told myself that Daniel was busy building his career, that Rachel had her own priorities, that young families sometimes forget how quickly time moves for the people who raised them. Those explanations had felt reasonable at the time, almost comforting. But now, sitting in the same kitchen where I had waited so many evenings for my phone to ring, those old excuses began to feel thin and fragile. I started remembering moments that I had quietly pushed aside during the past 2 years. The first one came from a visit to the hospital nearly a year earlier. I had just finished a particularly long treatment session and the nurse helped me gather my things before I left. As I walked past the front desk, I overheard one of the receptionists speaking with a man on the phone. She mentioned my name. I slowed down without meaning to, simply because hearing your own name in a hospital hallway always catches your attention. The receptionist said that yes, someone had called earlier asking about visiting hours for Margaret Collins, but that the caller never arrived. At the time I had assumed it must have been Daniel trying to check the schedule before coming later in the evening. I drove home that afternoon feeling grateful that he had at least thought about visiting. But now that memory felt different. If he truly intended to come, he would have come. Another memory followed shortly after that one, this time from the winter during my 2nd year of treatment. I had been sitting in the infusion room wrapped in a light hospital blanket when a volunteer walked through the corridor handing out small cups of hot chocolate for patients and their families. She stopped beside my chair and asked if my son wanted one as well. I remember smiling politely and telling her he was probably running late. She placed the extra cup on the small table beside my chair just in case he arrived. The hot chocolate slowly cooled while the hours passed. By the time the treatment finished, the cup had gone untouched. I threw it away quietly before leaving because I did not want the nurse to notice that I had been waiting. At the time those moments had felt minor, small details in a much larger struggle to recover my health. But now they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I had been alone through almost every appointment, every drive to the hospital, every evening when exhaustion settled into my bones like a heavy winter coat. Later that afternoon I opened the drawer beside the kitchen table where I kept old photographs. The wooden drawer slid open with the same soft sound it had made for years. Inside were small stacks of pictures from earlier decades of my life. I found one of Daniel when he was about 8 years old standing beside Richard in the backyard holding a small fishing rod. Richard had taught him how to cast that line during a summer vacation at a quiet lake 2 hours north of town. Daniel's face in the photograph was bright with the excitement children feel when the world seems simple and safe. Looking at that picture now, I wondered when the distance between us had truly begun. It was easy to assume it started after he married Rachel, but if I was honest with myself, the change had begun earlier than that. Careers become demanding. People move into new houses and new routines. Phone calls become shorter. Visits become less frequent. None of those things appear dramatic when they happen slowly. They simply blend into the background of everyday life until one day you notice that the connection you once relied on has faded quietly away. I placed the photograph back into the drawer and closed it gently. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking time the same way it had throughout my illness. For the first time since my diagnosis, I allowed myself to examine a possibility that had once felt too painful to consider. Perhaps Daniel had not stayed away because life was busy. Perhaps he had stayed away because the situation was inconvenient, uncomfortable, or simply outside the rhythm of the life he had built with Rachel. I did not feel angry as that thought settled into place. The emotion that replaced it was something quieter and more surprising. It was clarity. The kind of understanding that arrives slowly after a long period of uncertainty. During the 2 years of treatment, I had measured every day according to how difficult it might be for my son to visit. Now I realized that the more important question was not why he had stayed away but why I had continued waiting for him to appear. The afternoon. Sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor again, just as it had the previous day, and the house remained peaceful around me. In that moment I understood something that Richard had once tried to explain many years ago while we were sitting on the porch one quiet evening. He told me that the true measure of family is not found in promises or occasional messages but in the simple act of showing up when life becomes difficult. I had spent 2 years hoping for that act to happen. Now I finally understood that hope had been placed in the wrong direction. I sat at the kitchen table long after the sunlight had faded from the floor, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house and letting the memories of the past 2 years settle into place in a way they never had before. When you spend that much time fighting an illness, you learn to focus on the next appointment, the next test result, the next small sign that your body is holding on. There is very little room left to question the behavior of the people around you because survival becomes the only thing that matters. But now that the treatments were finished and the hospital visits had stopped, my mind finally had the space to look at everything with clear eyes. That evening I made myself a simple dinner, a bowl of soup and a slice of bread, the kind of meal that had become routine during the long months when my appetite had been unpredictable. I carried the bowl to the small table near the living room window where Richard and I used to sit together in the evenings after Daniel went to bed when he was young. Outside, the streetlights had just flickered on, casting soft yellow circles across the pavement. I could see the outline of the maple tree in the front yard swaying slightly in the cool breeze. For years that tree had been a quiet witness to our family's life. Richard planted it the summer Daniel turned 10, digging the hole himself with a shovel while Daniel ran around the yard pretending to help. I remember Richard wiping the sweat from his forehead and laughing as he told Daniel that trees and families both grow stronger when someone takes the time to care for them. At the time it had sounded like one of those gentle lessons parents pass down without thinking much about it. Sitting there now, I wondered what Richard would say if he could see the distance that had quietly formed between us all. After dinner I washed the dishes slowly and dried them with the same faded kitchen towel that had hung beside the sink for years. The routine felt peaceful, almost grounding, as though my life was slowly returning to its normal rhythm. When the dishes were finished I walked into the hallway and paused beside the small desk where I kept household papers and old letters. For a moment I hesitated before opening the top drawer because I already knew what was inside. Among the envelopes and receipts was a folder Richard had left for me several years before he passed away. At the time he gave it to me he said it was simply a collection of documents that might be useful someday. I had placed it in the drawer and rarely thought about it again because Richard had always been the organized one in our marriage. He handled most of the financial details while I focused on the daily life of our home. But that night something about the quiet house and the clarity in my mind made me pull the folder out and place it on the desk. The paper felt slightly stiff with age as I opened it. Inside were several neatly organized documents, all typed and signed in Richard's careful handwriting. I recognized the first page immediately as part of the trust he had established shortly before his health began to decline years ago. At the time he explained that it was simply a practical way to make sure the house and our savings would be handled properly in the future. I remember teasing him for being overly cautious because we had always lived a modest life and I never imagined those papers would become important anytime soon. Now, reading through the pages slowly under the soft light of the desk lamp, I began to notice details that I had overlooked before. Richard had included several instructions about how the trust should be managed and when certain assets could be accessed. The language was formal, the kind lawyers use to make sure every possibility is covered. I sat there quietly for a long time, reading each paragraph carefully, occasionally glancing up at the familiar hallway that led to the living room where so many years of family life had unfolded. What struck me most was the calm certainty in Richard's writing. He had always been a thoughtful man, someone who observed people closely even when he did not say much about it. As I reached the final page of the document, I noticed a short handwritten note he had added beneath the printed text. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the words were still clear. Richard had written that true character reveals itself during difficult seasons, not comfortable ones, and that any decisions about our family's future should always reflect that truth. I closed the folder slowly after reading that sentence and rested my hands on the desk. The house was completely silent except for the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. For the first time since the illness began, I felt something shifting quietly inside my thoughts. During the past 2 years I had measured love by the hope that someone might eventually walk through the door and sit beside me. But Richard's words reminded me of something far more important. Love is not measured by hope or by promises made during easy moments. It is measured by presence when life becomes difficult. And during the most difficult chapter of my life, that presence had not come from the people I expected. I placed the folder back into the drawer and turned off the desk lamp. As I walked back toward the living room, the quiet house no longer felt empty. Instead it felt honest, as though the truth had finally stepped forward and taken its place in the center of the room. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops along Maple Avenue. For a moment I simply lay there listening to the quiet house, thinking about the folder Richard had left in the drawer and the sentence he had written at the end of those documents. Some words stay with you in a way that refuses to fade. True character reveals itself during difficult seasons. I repeated that sentence slowly in my mind as I sat up and placed my feet on the floor. The house felt calm in the pale morning light, almost peaceful in a way it had not felt during the long months of treatment. I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker again, the same familiar routine that had become a small anchor during uncertain days. While the coffee brewed, I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves from the yard. Autumn had settled firmly over the neighborhood now, and the maple tree Richard planted years ago had turned a deep shade of red. I stood there quietly for several minutes, watching the sunlight slowly spread across the grass. For the first time in a long while I was not thinking about hospital schedules or medications. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. They were moving towards something I had avoided considering before. After finishing my coffee I went back to the small desk in the hallway and opened the drawer again. The folder lay exactly where I had left it the night before. I placed it on the desk and carefully reviewed the documents once more, this time reading them with a clearer understanding of what Richard had been preparing for. The trust he established years ago was not just a simple financial arrangement. It was structured in a way that protected the house, the savings, and several investments he had quietly managed during our marriage. I had always trusted him with those details because he had a steady mind for practical matters, but now I began to see the full picture. There were instructions about how certain assets should be handled and when they could be accessed. Some sections mentioned that the primary beneficiary during my lifetime was me alone, with no immediate transfer to anyone else until specific conditions were met. I noticed something else as I read more closely. Richard had included a clause that allowed the trust to remain entirely under my control for as long as I chose, without requiring approval from any other family member. That detail had seemed unimportant when he first explained it years ago. Now it felt very deliberate. I closed the folder and rested my hands on the desk again, thinking about the last few days. The quiet house. The empty hospital chair. The messages from Daniel that contained polite words but no presence. For a long time I had been focused on surviving the illness itself. I had not allowed myself to consider what life might look like afterward. Now that question stood clearly in front of me. Around mid-morning my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I walked over and saw Daniel's name on the screen. It had been nearly 2 days since I told him my final treatment was complete. I answered calmly and greeted him the same way I always had. His voice sounded slightly rushed, the way people often sound when they are balancing several things at once. He asked how I was feeling and whether the doctors were satisfied with the results. I told him that the treatments had ended and that the doctors were optimistic about recovery. There was a short pause on the line before he responded. Then he said something that caught my attention more than I expected. He asked whether I had spoken with anyone about the house or the financial paperwork that Richard had left behind years ago. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but the question lingered in the air between us. I told him that I had not made any decisions yet because I was still focusing on regaining my strength after treatment. Daniel said that made sense and that he and Rachel had simply been thinking about the future and how to keep everything organized. He mentioned that managing property and investments could become complicated over time. I listened quietly while he spoke, noticing how easily the conversation moved toward practical matters instead of the long months I had spent fighting for my health. When he finished I thanked him for checking on me and said we would talk again soon. After the call ended I set the phone back on the counter and looked around the kitchen. The sunlight had shifted again, illuminating the small scratches on the wooden table that Daniel made as a child while building school projects. The house had not changed. The memories had not changed. But something inside my understanding had become much clearer. During the past 2 years I had waited for my son to show up when life became difficult. Now that the difficult season had passed, he was suddenly interested in discussing the future. I did not feel anger as that realization settled into place. Instead I felt a quiet sense of awareness, the kind that arrives when a puzzle finally reveals its pattern. I walked back to the desk and returned the folder to the drawer, closing it gently. Richard had always believed that patience and clarity were more powerful than quick reactions. Standing there in the quiet hallway, I understood exactly what he meant. Some decisions are not made in moments of emotion. They are made after careful observation, when the truth has revealed itself slowly and completely. Over the next few days the rhythm of my life settled into something calm and steady, but the conversation with Daniel remained quietly in the back of my mind. When you have lived long enough you learn that certain questions reveal more than the person asking them intends. Daniel had not asked how I managed during the treatments. He had not asked what the doctors told me about recovery or how the long months alone in hospital waiting rooms had felt. Instead he asked about the house and the paperwork Richard had left behind. I did not judge him for that in the moment. I simply noticed it. And once you notice something clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee. The following Thursday afternoon the phone rang again while I was sitting in the living room reading a paperback novel I had borrowed from the public library down the street. The autumn sunlight filtered through the front window and rested across the carpet in long golden stripes. When I saw Rachel's name on the screen I paused for a moment before answering. Rachel rarely called me directly. In most conversations she spoke through Daniel or added a brief greeting in the background when he had me on speakerphone. I answered politely and asked how she was doing. Her voice sounded unusually warm that afternoon, the kind of friendliness people sometimes use when they are preparing to suggest something important. She said that she and Daniel had been talking about how happy they were that my treatment had finished and that they were thinking about visiting me soon. I thanked her and told her I would be glad to see them. Then she mentioned that Ethan had been asking about the house lately because he remembered spending summers in the backyard when he was younger. She said children grow up quickly and sometimes families begin to think about how homes and properties might stay within the next generation. I listened quietly while she spoke, noticing how naturally the conversation drifted toward The same subject Daniel had mentioned earlier in the week. The house. The property. The future. Rachel suggested that perhaps it would be helpful if we all sat down together sometime soon to discuss what Richard had arranged years ago and how things might look going forward. I told her that sounded reasonable and that we could talk whenever everyone had time. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the coffee table and leaned back in Richard's old armchair. The room felt peaceful in the afternoon light, but my thoughts were moving steadily through the small details of both conversations. Daniel had called first. Rachel had followed a few days later. Both had mentioned the same topic with careful politeness. It did not feel like coincidence. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, moving from the living room to the kitchen and then down the hallway where the small desk sat against the wall. The familiar drawer opened with its quiet wooden slide and the folder rested inside exactly where I had placed it earlier in the week. I did not open it this time. I simply looked at it for a moment before closing the drawer again. Richard had always believed that patience reveals more truth than confrontation. He used to say that if you give people enough time, they eventually show you what truly matters to them. Standing there in the hallway, I realized that time was beginning to do exactly that. Later that evening, I prepared a simple dinner and carried the plate to the kitchen table as the sky outside shifted into the soft blue of early evening. The neighborhood remained quiet except for the occasional sound of a passing car. After finishing the meal, I washed the dishes and stepped outside onto the front porch. The air had cooled noticeably and the leaves along Maple Avenue rustled gently in the breeze. Across the street, a neighbor was raking his yard into neat piles while his small dog followed him back and forth across the grass. Ordinary scenes like that once felt invisible during the long months of treatment when every day revolved around medical schedules. Now they seemed almost comforting. Life had continued moving forward even when my world had felt suspended inside hospital walls. I sat down in the porch chair Richard built years ago and looked out toward the maple tree in the yard. Daniel used to climb that tree when he was young, insisting he could see the entire neighborhood from the highest branch. Richard would stand below with his hands on his hips pretending to be stern while secretly smiling. Watching the branches move gently in the evening wind, I felt a quiet clarity settle over my thoughts. My son and his wife were beginning to pay attention again now that the difficult part of my life appeared to be over. Their interest had arrived not during the long nights in the hospital or the exhausting weeks of treatment, but afterward, when the conversation could turn toward property and plans for the future. I did not feel anger about that. Anger requires energy, and after 2 years of fighting illness I had learned to use my energy carefully. What I felt instead was something calmer and more deliberate. Awareness. The kind that allows you to observe events without rushing to react. I knew Daniel and Rachel would eventually suggest that family discussions take place soon. I also knew that Richard had prepared those documents with careful thought long before any of these conversations began. As the evening light faded and the porch grew darker around me, I understood that the next steps would not require confrontation or raised voices. They would require patience and clarity, the same qualities Richard trusted most. Because sometimes the most powerful response is not to argue or explain, but simply to allow the truth to reveal itself while you quietly decide what comes next. The following week unfolded with a quiet steadiness that almost felt deliberate, as though life itself was giving me the time I needed to observe everything clearly. The weather along Maple Avenue continued shifting deeper into autumn, and every morning the maple tree in the yard dropped a few more crimson leaves across the grass. I began taking longer walks around the neighborhood, slowly rebuilding my strength after the long months of treatment. During those walks I often thought about Richard and the way he approached difficult decisions. He never rushed. He listened. He watched. And then he acted only when he understood the entire picture. By the middle of the week Daniel called again, this time in the early evening when the sky outside had already begun fading into that soft gray color that appears just before sunset. I answered calmly and asked how work had been going. His voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost eager. He said he and Rachel had been talking and thought it would be nice to visit me over the weekend. He mentioned that Ethan might come along if he did not have too much homework. I told him that would be fine and that the house would always be open to them. Then, almost casually, he returned to the subject that had quietly hovered over our recent conversations. He said it might also be a good opportunity for us to sit down together and look over the documents Richard had prepared years ago. He explained that managing financial matters early could prevent confusion later, especially when families grow and responsibilities expand. I listened quietly while he spoke, noticing how carefully he framed each sentence. When he finished, I simply told him that we could talk about anything he wished when he arrived. After the call ended, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes, watching the soft reflection of the ceiling light against the polished surface of the wood. The conversation had not surprised me. In fact, it felt like the natural next step in a pattern that had been revealing itself piece by piece over the past several days. Daniel and Rachel had shown little interest during the years when my health was uncertain, but now that the illness was behind me, they were suddenly eager to discuss the future. I stood up and walked toward the hallway desk again, the same place where Richard's folder remained tucked safely inside the drawer. I did not open it this time. I already knew what the documents contained and what they represented. Instead, I rested my hand on the edge of the desk and looked down the quiet hallway toward the living room where the evening light rested gently on the carpet. Memories have a way of appearing in moments like that. I remembered Daniel as a small boy racing through this very hallway with a toy airplane in his hand, pretending he was flying across the country on some great adventure. Richard used to stand near the doorway laughing while reminding him to slow down before he knocked something over. Those memories were real, and they still belonged to this house, just as much as the quiet present moment did. Later that night, I stepped outside onto the porch again, wrapping a light sweater around my shoulders as the air grew cooler. The street was calm and nearly empty except for the distant sound of a car turning onto the next block. The porch light cast a soft circle across the wooden floorboards Richard had repaired himself years ago during one of his weekend projects. I sat in the same chair and looked out toward the yard, watching the leaves move gently in the wind. In that quiet space, I realized that the upcoming visit would reveal something important, not because of any argument or confrontation, but because simple conversations often show people exactly as they are. Daniel believed he was coming to discuss practical matters about property and planning. Rachel likely believed the same thing. But I knew that the conversation would also reveal something deeper about priorities and about the choices people make when they believe no one is paying close attention. The following day passed peacefully. I spent the morning organizing small things around the house that I had neglected during treatment, sorting through old mail, watering the plants near the kitchen window, and opening the windows to let the cool autumn air circulate through the rooms. The house felt alive again, no longer defined by illness or hospital schedules. By the time Saturday arrived, the sky was bright and clear, the kind of crisp fall day that makes the entire neighborhood seem freshly washed by sunlight. I woke early and prepared a pot of coffee, then tidied the kitchen in the quiet way people do when they know guests will arrive later in the day. Around mid-morning, I noticed a car turning slowly onto Maple Avenue from the main road. Even from the porch, I recognized Daniel's vehicle immediately. It rolled gently down the street before stopping in front of the house. For a moment, I simply watched through the window as Daniel stepped out and walked around to the passenger's side, where Rachel emerged with her usual careful composure. Ethan climbed out from the back seat carrying a small backpack, his eyes already wandering toward the yard where he had once played as a child. Seeing them there stirred a complicated mixture of memory and understanding inside me. Families carry history whether they acknowledge it or not. I opened the front door before they reached the porch and greeted them with the same calm warmth I had always offered. Daniel smiled and gave me a brief hug while Rachel offered a polite greeting and stepped inside the house as though returning to a familiar place she had not visited in a long time. Ethan wandered toward the living room window, already studying the maple tree outside. The house filled with quiet conversation as coats were set aside and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. Daniel soon mentioned that perhaps we could sit down together at the table and talk about a few things he had been thinking about. I nodded calmly and gestured toward the chairs around the kitchen table where so many family meals had once taken place. As we all sat down in the gentle afternoon light, I realized that the moment Richard had prepared for years ago was quietly beginning to unfold. Daniel leaned forward slightly as we all settled around the kitchen table, resting his hands on the polished wood surface that still carried faint scratches from years of family meals and school projects. Rachel sat beside him with a calm expression, her posture neat and composed as though this conversation had already been carefully rehearsed in her mind. Ethan had wandered toward the living room again where he could see the maple tree through the window, leaving the three of us in the quiet kitchen filled with the soft afternoon light of early autumn. Daniel cleared his throat gently and began speaking in a thoughtful tone, explaining that he and Rachel had simply been thinking about the future and about how important it was for families to stay organized when it came to property and financial planning. He mentioned that the house had always been a meaningful place for all of us and that Ethan had fond memories of playing in the yard when he was younger. Rachel nodded slightly as he spoke, adding that planning ahead could make things easier for everyone in the long run. I listened quietly while they talked, noticing how carefully they chose their words. There was no anger in their voices and no urgency either, only the polite language people often use when they believe they are discussing something practical and reasonable. When Daniel finished speaking, he looked at me with an expression that suggested he expected some kind of response. I folded my hands together on the table and smiled gently before standing up from my chair. The hallway desk was only a few steps away, and the drawer opened with the same quiet wooden sound it had made many times before. I took the folder out slowly and carried it back to the table where Daniel and Rachel watched with calm curiosity. The papers inside were neatly arranged just as Richard had left them years ago, the edges slightly worn but still carefully preserved. I placed the folder in front of Daniel and opened it so that the first page faced him. For a moment none of us spoke. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall, marking the quiet passage of seconds as Daniel began reading the documents. Rachel leaned closer to look at the pages with him, her expression focused as her eyes moved carefully across the printed lines. I poured another cup of coffee for each of us while they read, setting the cups gently on the table without interrupting the silence that had settled over the room. After several minutes, Daniel looked up from the papers with a slightly puzzled expression. He explained that he understood most of what the trust described but wanted to confirm something about how the ownership of the house and certain investments were structured. I nodded calmly and pointed to a section near the bottom of the document where Richard had outlined the arrangement in precise language. The trust placed all authority and decision-making entirely in my hands for as long as I was alive. No transfer of property or financial control could occur unless I personally chose to make that decision. Daniel read the section again more slowly this time while Rachel's expression became thoughtful. Neither of them spoke immediately, but I could see that the meaning of Richard's planning was becoming clear. After another moment, Daniel set the papers down carefully and leaned back in his chair. He said that he had not realized the arrangement placed so much responsibility directly with me. I smiled gently and explained that Richard had always believed each person should have the freedom to make decisions about their own life without pressure or expectation from others. Rachel asked whether I had already thought about what I might want to do in the future with the house and the investments Richard had left behind. Her voice was polite and controlled, but there was a quiet curiosity beneath the question. I rested my hands on the edge of the table and looked around the kitchen for a moment, letting my eyes move across the familiar room where so many years of family life had taken place. The sunlight from the window rested softly on the cabinets Richard had installed himself more than 20 years ago. Outside, the branches of the maple tree moved gently in the breeze. When I finally spoke, my voice remained calm and steady. I told them that during the 2 years of my illness I had spent many long hours alone thinking about what truly matters in a family. Illness has a way of clarifying things that once seemed complicated. It shows you who appears when life becomes difficult and who stays away until the difficult part has already passed. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair but did not interrupt. Rachel listened quietly with her hands folded in front of her. I continued speaking in the same calm tone, explaining that Richard had prepared those documents not only to organize our finances but also to protect the independence of the person who remained in this house after he was gone. The trust allowed me to make decisions when I felt ready and not before. I told them that I appreciated their interest in planning for the future, but that my focus now was on living the years ahead with the same independence Richard wanted me to have. The house would remain mine to care for and enjoy for as long as I chose. The investments would remain under my control until I decided otherwise. Daniel looked down at the papers again and nodded slowly as though absorbing the final clarity of the situation. Rachel remained quiet for a moment before offering a polite smile and saying that it made sense for me to take all the time I needed. The tension that had quietly filled the room began to dissolve, replaced by a calmer understanding of where things truly stood. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder before returning it to the hallway drawer. When I came back to the kitchen, Daniel and Rachel were standing near the window watching Ethan toss a handful of fallen leaves into the air outside beneath the maple tree. For the first time since their arrival, the conversation returned to ordinary things such as school, work, and the changing weather. As the afternoon sunlight slowly faded toward evening, I realized that the moment Richard had quietly prepared for years earlier had unfolded exactly as he intended, without arguments or raised voices, only with the simple clarity of truth revealed at the right time.